12 hours so far. So at this event, at the 20th anniversary event, approximately 10 years ago, I think it was a little longer ago, we had a dinner at the end of the day, and Latvizada gave a fantastic review of the history of computer science at Berkeley from something like the 1950s to about the early 70s. And unfortunately at that time, we forgot to grab his notes, and kind of pervasive video cameras, cheap video cameras were not available, I guess, in the early 1990s or something. But it was lost to the eons of history. Tonight we're not going to make that mistake again. So we are going to videotape this. We've got the notes. I think it'll be an interesting talk. I've asked Dick Karp, who was the first chair of the computer science division in 1973 when computer science department was merged with electrical engineering to form the electrical engineering and computer science department. He was the first associate chair, chair of computer science division, and I can't imagine someone who could give us a better picture of what the history was from 1970 to approximately today. Is there anyone else in this room who does not need an introduction than Richard Karp? He was highlighted in today's introductory history talk about the foundation of theoretical computer science at Berkeley, with the key concept of reducibility and NP completeness as a fundamental contribution from that time. I remember hearing a talk or talking to Dick about how when he was a researcher at IBM Research, he was working on all these routing problems for circuit boards, and seeing that no matter how hard or how clever your algorithms is, they just took a long, long time to complete, to come up with a good solution. And that, of course, that whole class of problems we now know to be NP complete. In addition to being an able administrator and the first person to sort of organize the division within the department, he's an outstanding teacher. He's won the Campus Teaching Award. I think it's fair to say he's the most famous computer scientist on our faculty, in addition to having won the ACM Turing Award, the Nobel Prize in Computer Science. He also holds the National Medal of Science. He's a member of the National Academy of Engineering. He's a member of the National Academy of Science. He has, you look at that time chart that you have in the little 30-year brochure we put together, about 50% of the entries have Dick Karp's name on them. So with that, I think I'd like to turn the floor over to Dick to give us a personal view of the 30 years of Berkeley computer science, 1973 to today. You can see I don't really know how to count. Lapel up here and pockets.
Well, I hope you've all enjoyed the events of the last day as much as I have. I think the presentations by our faculty made me very proud.
This is for the room. This mic.
Yeah, I think the quality of the talks was surpassed only by the quality of the corridor conversation with all of our visitors. So it's been a great event. As I began preparing tonight's remarks, I realized that my most vivid memories go back to the earliest times I spent at Berkeley, even before the formation of the computer science division. So I'm going to begin by giving you a little bit of prehistory. I arrived in Berkeley in the Christmas season of 1968. Full of enthusiasm and anticipation about my new faculty position. Feeling that way not merely because Berkeley was a good university and an interesting and enjoyable place to live, but because, in my view, Berkeley was the best university, and it was in the location in the country that suited me the best. And I have never wavered from that belief in the intervening 35 years. Part of my reasons for feeling that way had to do with the academics at Berkeley, but there were also some non-academic considerations that were very important in the turbulent year of 1968. 4 years earlier, the free speech movement had transformed Berkeley from a small, sleepy college town into a cauldron of social activism at the focal point of every liberation movement that was going on in the world at that time, and also a center of resistance to the war in Vietnam and the eventual expansion of it to Cambodia. And I have to admit that part of my reason for being interested in moving to Berkeley at that time was because I felt that Berkeley was where the action was. And indeed, there was a spirit of activism in the air which tended to weld together the people who were involved. I remember, for example, driving out to Santa Rita Prison in the middle of the night to bail my colleague and friend Gene Lawler out of jail because he had been arrested for participating in an unlawful march through the streets of Berkeley. But there were also some academic reasons for being interested in coming to Berkeley. The master plan for the University of California that was set forth under Clark Kerr's leadership in 1960 promised to make the university system, the public university system in California, the envy of the world, and as indeed it did become. And Berkeley was the flagship of that enterprise. A few years earlier, the first National Research Council rating of graduate schools had come. And Berkeley really stood head and shoulders above all the other universities because of the breadth of its excellence. Berkeley had a significantly larger number of top 5 departments than any other university in the country. And then also there was the mystique of names like Seaborg and Lawrence and Oppenheimer and Tarski and Neyman and so many others, which made Berkeley, in my eyes, a very glamorous place. Upon my arrival, I quickly learned that computer science at Berkeley was in a rather unstable situation with 2 academic programs independently trying to develop their curricula. So let me give you a little bit of the background which led up to that critical situation in 1968. Digital computation at Berkeley began with Paul Morton as early as 1948 when he designed the California digital computer, CalDIC. It was a vacuum tube computer with a magnetic drum memory. There were some interesting people involved in that project. Al Hoagland, who became a guru of magnetic recording, and Doug Engelbart, whose work on the augmentation of intelligence by computers, the augmentation of intellect, became so prescient and influential a bit later. Paul Morton established the first computer courses and also the first service center at the University of California. Another important influence in the early days was Harry Huskey, who was on the faculty from 1957 to 1965. Harry Huskey had worked on the ENIAC. He had worked with Turing on the ACE computer in England. He was the designer of the SWAC, the Bendix G15. And at Berkeley, he worked on a project called the NELIAC. It was a language which was a variant of ALGOL. And among those who worked with him were Nicholas Verth and Ken Thompson. During the 1960s, the electrical engineering department built up a significant presence in computer science, including a number of people who became core members of the eventual computer science division. In the mid-60s, from 63 to 68, I think it was, Lotfi Zada was the chair of the department. In fact, I first met Lotfi in 1964 when I was offered a faculty position in EE, but at that time I wasn't quite ready to make the leap to academia. Under Lotfi, the name of the department was changed to EECS in 1965. And I think Lotfi was one of the members of the department who understood that computer science was going to develop into a central enabling discipline for every central enabling tool and resource for every discipline and every field. However, there was a countervailing view in the department where people preferred to emphasize the connections of computer science along a continuum with other fields that dealt with the processing of information, such as control theory, or cybernetics was a fashionable term for it at the time, and information theory. And there was a feeling that those connections and that continuum of the discipline should be emphasized, the unity between electrical engineering and computer science. And also electrical engineering itself was regarded as a broad unifying discipline. And it was also felt that work in area such as devices and circuits actually underlay digital computing and was very central. And so the department had within it both separatists and conservatives. Separatists who are striving for a well-defined, separate, independent identity for computer science, and conservatives who, on very reasonable intellectual grounds at that time, felt that the unity of the department was important above all, and that there was a continuum between computer science and electrical engineering, as indeed I believe there is. In 1967, several of the faculty from electrical engineering split off, Butler Lampson, Mike Harrison, and Marty Graham, to join a newly formed computer science department in the College of Letters and Science. They were joined by Beresford Parlett from mathematics, who became the chair of the department. Interestingly, as an aside, I should mention that I've always found Beresford an extremely charming and witty man, and I remember many of the things that he's told me over the years. One of the things I treasure and that I try to remember as a guide for my own activities is something he said. He said, if it's not worth doing, it's not worth doing well. And there are just tremendously valuable applications as anybody knows who has served as a faculty member. Very soon after the formation of the department, Mike Harrison talked me into accepting a faculty position. It wasn't very hard for him to twist my arm at all. Beresford brought his esteemed colleague Velvel Kahan, and in fact they were talking about the 3 Ks. In addition to the 2 of us, the third one was Don Knuth, but as you know, he went elsewhere. Yeah, never heard it again. That guy could have had a pretty good career. At the junior level, we had Jim Morris, now the dean of the School of Computer Science at Carnegie Mellon. And Jay Early, who had written a brilliant thesis in parsing of context-free languages under Bob Floyd at Carnegie Mellon. Jay found other interests and moved on to become a transformational psychologist, still practicing in Berkeley today. Susan Graham joined the computer science department in 1971. Holding up the humanities side, because one of the things that was supposed to distinguish the computer science department from engineering was that we were to foster the humanities, was Laura Gould, who was the first computer science faculty member at Berkeley to receive the Distinguished Teaching Award. So it was quite a terrific collection of people, and I should also mention Steve Cook, whom you may have heard of, who was primarily on the faculty of mathematics, but also had a partial appointment in computer science. And it's to our great shame that even though we tried our best, we were not able to persuade the math department to give him tenure. I think if he had done his work on the NP completeness of the satisfiability problem a little earlier, they might have relented. The top students in the department included Jim Gray, Bruce Lindsay, Vaughn Pratt, Barbara Gross, and Peter Deutsch. One of the main activities at the time was something that grew out of Project Genie under Dave Evans in the electrical engineering department earlier in the middle 60s, where they developed the SDS 940 by adding virtual memory and paging to an earlier SDS machine. And some of the core people on that project were Butler Lamson, Chuck Thacker, and Peter Deutsch, all of whom moved on to become key members of the historic group at Xerox PARC. And by the way, congratulations to Butler and Chuck for sharing in the Draper Prize, which is sometimes called the Nobel Prize of Engineering. After a little while, it became apparent that it was counterproductive for the Berkeley campus to have two separate and independent departments developing their very similar curricula in the two colleges. And so it was clear that something was going to have to be done about this situation. Marty Graham, by that time, had succeeded Beresford as chair of computer science. And he decided to bring in a review committee to evaluate and make recommendations for the LNS computer science department. That committee included Alan Perlis, George Forsyth, Dana Scott. There's one other member whose name is lost in the mists of history. Somebody from Cornell. I don't think it was Hartmanis. I don't remember who it was. Well, that committee sort of metastasized into something bigger. Chancellor Bowker took a very strong interest in their deliberations and used their conclusions as a springboard for trying to set into motion some process to resolve the two department situation. Feelings ran very high. There was a lot of tension at the time between the two groups. There were a few who clung to the idea of maintaining the status quo, the two department situation, but most realized that the two viable alternatives were either to found a new computer science department in the College of Engineering or to merge us back into electrical engineering. The management of the decision fell to Vice Chancellor Mark Christensen. And I remember at the time that there was a lot of concern and a lot of paranoia because the deliberations that were going on leading to Christensen's decision were pretty much a black box to which the ordinary faculty didn't have access. And so we had all kinds of suspicions about what might be going on. Eventually, Christensen came down with his decision, which, as you know, was to merge the computer science department back in with the computer science faculty in ECS as a division with its associate chair and with a significant degree of autonomy in matters of appointment and promotion. Once the decision was a fait accompli, the feelings, I think, calmed down and people began to cooperate very well. Later, the arrangement morphed into a more symmetric version in which there were two divisions of the department, computer science on one hand and electrical engineering on the other, and a chairman who might come from either of those divisions. And in fact, Randy Katz became later, way in the 90s, became the first computer scientist to, and thus far the only one, I think, to chair the... And
it only took 20 years.
And it only took, yeah. But it was
very symmetric.
Yeah, it was very. Well, it was worth the wait. I was chosen as the first associate chair. My qualifications were, first, that I was on the losing side. It was considered politic to pick somebody from the losing side as a kind of accommodation. And secondly, that I had been rather aloof from the politics, so I hadn't made too many enemies. I had no other positive qualifications. I was completely inexperienced in academic affairs. And in fact, I made a great many rookie mistakes. We were crammed into Evans Hall, where the ensconced mathematics and statistics departments ruled the roost. We struggled mightily with the Evans Hall Space Committee to get a reasonable amount of space, but never succeeded. We had some pretty tough people on that committee. Betty Scott was a tiger, I remember. So we were shoehorned into Evans Hall. One of my rookie mistakes had to do with our attempts to get the College of Engineering to approve a graduate degree specifically in computer science. The committee turned us down flat. They felt that since we were part of the ECS department, a computer science designation on a diploma didn't make sense. As an inexperienced administrator, I was ready to simply accept that decision, but some of my wiser colleagues goaded me into taking an end run around the college and going to the dean of the graduate school, Sanford Elberg, who delighted in reversing the decision of the College of Engineering, which was his arch enemy, and granting us the degree. One of the reasons I was able to muddle through in my brief term as associate chair was that Tom Everhart was the chair of the department. Tom was magnificent. Tom was extremely sensitive to our needs for autonomy. He was extremely supportive. There were times when he must have known that I was really screwing up, but he intervened only as a last resort because he respected the fact that we had to feel our way as an autonomous unit. I think Tom and I developed considerable respect for each other, and I have, to this day, very warm feelings for him. He was invited to this event, and he sent his regrets with a very nice note to Randy Katz. A very fortunate side effect of the merger from my personal point of view was that Gene Lawler and Manuel Blum, who came from the EE department, became my closest colleagues as theoreticians. Gene, who died young at the age of 61 in 1994, was an expert in combinatorial optimization and also the first person in computer science at Berkeley to work in genomics back around 1989 or 1990. Gene was the social conscience of the computer science division. Gene was always on the side of the underdog. He was always looking out for the interests of underprivileged minorities, handicapped individuals, women. He worked very closely with Sheila Humphreys on the organization and administration of our reentry program, which for a number of years provided a means for women and minorities with non-standard backgrounds to re-enter computer science. Manuel, and I'm so delighted that Manuel chose to come. We leaned on him and leaned on him and leaned on his wife and used every means of every means at our disposal to get him to come, and it's just delightful to see him. Manuel has been my role model and inspiration. He is a phenomenal teacher. He has some mysterious, inimitable ability to draw out the creativity from the students in his classes and the students that he works with in research. I've seen his effectiveness with my own eyes because he taught my son to drive at age 2. Little Jeremy would sit on Manuel's lap, and they would find a deserted street, and Jeremy would weave his way down the street while Manuel manipulated the gas and the brake. And I want Manuel to know that Jeremy, who's now 15, has developed into a very good driver. Manuel always attracted the most brilliant and original students in theoretical computer science. Many of their names were mentioned by Christos in his talk this morning, and I'll mention some of those names again a little later. And he was inspiring to those students, many of whom have gone on to do brilliant things. And I venture to say that Manuel is the most productive thesis advisor in the history of computer science. I remember one of the things that made Manuel so special is his deep and sincere concern and consideration for people around him. I remember one time complaining to Manuel that I was kind of unhappy with the students in my undergraduate course. They didn't seem to really get it, and I was a bit disappointed. And he said to me, "You know, Dick, you're better than they are at what you do, but there are things that you could learn from any one of them." And this is the way he tended to view people, that everybody had unique value. After the merger, we were not among the very top computer science departments. The big three were Stanford, CMU, and MIT. They had the AI labs, the ARPA grants, the PDP-10s. Cornell was also rated ahead of us, and then there were a group, including us and the University of Illinois and a couple of others, who were sort of at the next echelon. But there was definitely a gap there, which has long since been closed, as we all know. The first activity that really put us on the map was Berkeley Unix, which was led by Bob Fabry and Domenico Ferrari, later by Susan Graham, with extremely important input from Ken Thompson and the magical software design skills of Bill Joy, among others. Berkeley Unix was the first large-scale open-source academic software project. And I think it provided an example of an approach to innovation. Some people call it an innovation ecology. That's a fancy term for it, which was quite different from the closed research lab highly proprietary approach to innovation that was practiced before that. And I think that Berkeley Unix served as a model for later developments, notably Linux in recent times. Another major breakthrough for us in the early period was Ingress, developed by Stonebreaker and Wong, the first of a series of important database developments at Berkeley involving also Larry Rowe, importantly, which was the first implementation to establish clearly the practical value of the relational model of Ted Codd and its advantages over the navigational models that had existed for database systems before that. Over the 80s and 90s, there, of course, had been a number of other extraordinary achievements in research, and those were mostly enumerated in the talks this morning, so I'll truncate my remarks about them, but I'll mention a few. One of them was Velvel Khan's tremendous influence in the development of the IEEE 754 standard for floating point arithmetic. Velvel has always been a believer against all evidence in the power of rational argument to to resolve issues. And this is a case where one of those rare cases where rational argument did prevail, not without difficulties, but all of the participants with their different viewpoints were forced to understand and agree that Velvel's proposals, together with Koonin and Harold Stone, were right, and indeed his ideas have become the absolute standard in the field. I think, as Dave mentioned in his talk this morning, we all enjoyed the talks that Velvel used to give about all of the anomalies and aberrations that occurred in the floating point arithmetic realizations in calculators and computers. So we're very lucky that Velvel thought hard about floating point arithmetic so that the rest of us don't have to. Dave talked this morning about RISC and RAID and SPIR and NOW, and I don't know if you mentioned IRAM, but there are all these things, all these projects. So I'm not going to try to explain the tremendous influence of these projects, but I'd like to make a kind of meta remark, which I actually drew from a talk that Dave gave to the faculty at a retreat a couple of years ago, that behind all of these projects, and of course there were many other participants, Carlo, Randy, and so on. Behind all of these projects, there was a certain, and John Oosterhout, of course, there was a certain philosophy as to how one should mobilize graduate students in computer architecture to give them the experience that they needed and to produce absolutely top-class research. And the idea was to find a theme and a project that was substantial enough to really shake up the industry, that there were windows of opportunity because of the state of technology that dictated a deviation from the way architecture was done. And the idea was to recognize those opportunities early and then to develop long-range projects involving as many as 20 or 30 students that would not only develop the concepts, but would carry things through to prototypes and create new industries. And this has been this approach, and in the process, to educate these students and prepare them to move on to leading roles as faculty members or scientists in industry. And this approach has proved itself over and over again and is a hallmark of the way things are done at Berkeley. Not that it's the only way things can be done, but it's a very important element in the way things are done. Another important development was the creation of the International Computer Science Institute in 1988 with Jerry Feldman as its director for the first 10 years. followed ably by Nelson Morgan more recently. And that has allowed our community to extend its reach in areas like speech and natural language processing, networking, and algorithms. It's been interesting over the years to watch the progress of Lotfi Zada's work in fuzzy logic and other areas of soft computing. Lotfi developed his initial ideas along these lines in the 60s. His ideas are radical, very controversial. He's had ardent supporters and also harsh critics. And I think that the fruition of fuzzy logic in the design of control systems in the 80s and 90s has to be deeply satisfying. But Lotfi is an unusual man. Despite criticism and praise, he never wavers from his convictions. He's not unduly affected by the views of his admirers, nor by the views of his critics. He's a person who knows what he thinks is right. I recall another piece of wisdom that Lotfi gave to me some years ago. He said to me, Dick, whatever people say about you, take it as a compliment. In 1974, a wet behind the ears student named Ralph Merkel started coming around, pestering the faculty with his crazy ideas. Ralph Merkel had the idea that it would be possible to construct a secret communication system in which anybody could send a message to a certain individual. That individual was later named Bob. But Bob would be the only one who could decode those secret messages. In other words, Ralph Merkel had invented public key cryptography. Now, Ralph wasn't particularly lucid. And he didn't have the technical apparatus to really lay it out in a rigorous fashion. And so he was basically ignored and brushed off by the faculty at Berkeley. He found out that Diffie and Hellman down at Stanford had rediscovered the same idea. And so he went down and worked with them and eventually got his PhD at Stanford. So we missed an opportunity there to be pioneers in cryptography, but we made up for it a few years later when in the early 80s, the three seminal papers for the complexity theoretic foundations of cryptography came out of Berkeley. There was the probabilistic encryption paper by two brilliant students, Shafi Goldwasser and Silvio Micali. There was the Blum-Micali paper on pseudo-random generation and Andy Yao's paper on pseudo-random generation. So Berkeley has made pivotal contributions to cryptography. And these are among the many contributions in theoretical computer science that have been made over the years. Christos did a great job of describing these. I won't go into detail, but just to mention a few, there's Narendra Karmakar's interior point method for linear programming, which he developed in the period after completing his PhD thesis here while he was still at Berkeley. Gary Miller's primality testing algorithm. And probably the biggest thing of all was the work on probabilistically checkable proofs, this incredible idea that Christos outlined this morning about proofs that are holographic in the sense that a bug, if it occurs, pervades the whole proof and can easily be found by a small random sample. And the very interesting conclusion that, which follows from that certain NP-hard problems are hard to solve approximately as well as being hard to solve exactly. And that's, I believe, the biggest breakthrough in complexity theory of the last 2 decades. And the There are many people involved in that, including our Miller professor, Muli Safra, who's sitting in the back of the room. But among the Berkeley people, one can mention Sanjeev Arora, Madhu Sudan, and Rajiv Madhwani all had a hand in that. And some of the preparatory work for that, some of the developments that were needed, came from Manuel Blum's work on program checking, and also from work that Shafi Goldwasser participated in. Shafi, by the way, is the only person to have received the Gödel Prize twice. Another critical development in a different area was the Soda Hall graphics walkthrough, our architectural interactive walkthrough by Carlos Acan and Seth Teller and the walkthrough project at the time of the construction of Soda Hall. And I could go on, and it's only my ignorance of some areas that prevents me from adding equally meritorious achievements to the list in scientific computing and compilers and operating systems and virtually any area. It's also interesting to enumerate some of the important books that have come out of Berkeley. One of the great titles of all time is O Pascal by Mike Clancy and Doug Cooper. I got to know Doug Cooper very well when he rented my house from me. I can't say it was an entirely pleasant relationship. They chose O Pascal because it begins with OH, and that puts it just ahead of all the other Pascal books on the shelves. There's the definitive book on context-free languages by Mike Harrison, Gene Lawler's beautiful book on combinatorial optimization. I'm mentioning only books that were written by people when they were actually here, rather than a long list of books by people who are here now but wrote them earlier. And then Berkeley has produced the canonical textbooks in a number of important areas. There's the Russell Norvig text in artificial intelligence, the Patterson-Hennessy books on quantitative approaches to architecture, and Randy Katz's book on logic design. There are a couple of other books. Those are all very well known to this group, but there are a couple of other books that may not be quite as well known. One of the most charming and interesting mathematics books I've ever read is the book Winning Ways by Conway Guy and Elwyn Berlekamp, which sets forth an amazing theory of a certain class of combinatorial games. I won't try to explain anything about the content of the book, but what I do want to say is that it's the only mathematics book I know which is completely rigorous in its presentation without falling back on the definition theorem proof style, the dry definition theorem proof style. The book manages at the same time to be completely rigorous and completely conversational with a minimum of formal apparatus. And it's just an absolute tour de force. It's a 2-volume series. The other book, which you may not know about, is Christos Papadimitriou's novel, Turing. Christos, of course, has written a number of books before he came to Berkeley, but Turing was written more recently. It manages to be two things. On the one hand, it's a brilliant exposition of the theory of computation, but then on the other hand, it reveals the author's unbelievable poetic imagination. I don't think there's another computer scientist in the world who could write with such poetic sweep as Christos has done in that book. Now, of course, one of the historic moments in the division was the acquisition of Soda Hall. Domenico Ferrari seemed to be the first person who was associate chair just prior to the project's initiation, or during the initiation, seemed to be the first person to actually believe that we could pull this off and to get behind it. And then the fundraising was the work of many people, but most notably, this was one of the many occasions in the history where we benefited tremendously for being affiliated with the EE wing of the department, because many of the elder statesmen of the electrical engineering part of the department were very much in our corner in doing the fundraising and getting the donations from industry that were required for Soda Hall. And in particular with the Japanese companies, Berkeley had an enormous reputation because of the work of the 50s and 60s in areas like logic design and design automation and circuit synthesis. And in a real sense, one could say that in large measure, Soda Hall is a payback to the computer science division for SPICE. And of course, we owe enormous thanks to Carlo for his tireless creative work with the architects to make sure that Soda Hall turned out to be the functional and attractive building that it is. And Soda has been absolutely critical for our continued success and ability to grow. Not long after we moved into Soda, there came what seemed at the time to be a rather unhappy event, but it may have actually worked to our advantage in the long run, and that was VERIP. The university had at the same time a lean operating budget and a fat pension system. And so they decided to solve their budget problems by offering attractive retirement possibilities to faculty of a certain age. And 7 of us succumbed to this: Domenico Ferrari, Mike Harrison, Gene Lawler, Beresford Parlett, Shitora Ramamurthy, Mike Stonebreaker, and I. And we were among the 300 Berkeley faculty who took that offer. And there were tremendous fears at the time that this would be the death knell for Berkeley, that we would never recover. I decided to use the opportunity to do something wild and crazy and change my life. So I took a position at a large state university on the West Coast. But I couldn't stay away, and so in 1999 I unretired, and I am now a professor demeritus. There were dire predictions about the fate of the Berkeley campus and the fate of the EECS department. I wasn't around at the time to know how we pulled it off, but we almost immediately had a string of brilliant recruiting successes. And in fact, the caliber of the recruitment since VERIP has been unbelievable. I think every person that we've hired is either already a luminary or well on the way to being one. And when I returned in 1999, I saw, it was clear that the department was much more of a powerhouse than it had ever been before. And we had ventured into a number of new areas, moving with the times. Networking and communications, computer security, human-computer interfaces, and then a little bit afterwards, computational biology started to be developed on campus with strong participation from EECS. The hiring of Gene Myers was a tremendous coup for us, for example. And the state-funded Citrus project to investigate societal applications launched us in a completely new direction under the leadership of Virginia Baikshi, and then earlier Andy Katz and Jim Demmel, who continue to participate in the leadership. So there have just been a series of successes in recruiting and in branching out to new areas, which have brought us back far beyond the level that we were at before VERIP. Of course, everyone knows that the internet and distributed computing have completely changed the scene, have completely changed the face of both computer science and electrical engineering. And I believe that the department's response to these radical new developments illustrates why computer science and electrical engineering belong together. We've been able to develop a kind of portfolio of synergistic projects across the whole span of software and hardware and algorithmics and conceptual design and applications that are connected with the developments in the internet, the developments in sensor nets and distributed and wireless computing. The activities range from smart dust to multimedia tablet computers to Ocean Store, backed up by theoretical support from the information theorists, the control theorists, the systems people, and the algorithms and protocols people. And in general, this is just one example of what I consider to be one of our greatest blessings, which is that we are affiliated with electrical engineering. I think this has stood the test of time, and it's particularly fruitful at Berkeley because not only the computer science wing, but also the electrical engineering wing of the department have tilted more and more towards information technology, so that at the expense of applied physics, but nevertheless towards information technology. So that we are really just a huge department of information technology. And I think that there are at least 15 faculty sitting in Corey Hall who could easily be classified as computer science faculty. One of the unfortunate things about our existence is that we do have these two buildings, and even though it's only the width of Hearst Avenue that separates them, it creates a real sociological gulf, which we try to cure by having joint lunches and other mechanisms. But this is a problem for us, and as Carlo was telling me this morning, it's only going to be exacerbated when we're divided among 3 buildings after the completion of the Citrus building. So this is going to be one of the issues that we have to work out. Well, enough about our brilliant science and our brilliant research. What about the computer science division as a community and as a teaching institution? Well, first of all, over all the years I've been here, we've always had remarkably dedicated staff who seem to maintain their high morale despite backbreaking work assignments and too little credit from the faculty, because we're all so busy running around that we don't take the time to not only to smell the roses, but to give the staff people a pat on the back. But they've just been terrific. There are a number of people who've had extensive spans of time in the department and who have become really mainstays that we couldn't manage without. Another thing that I particularly like about computer science at Berkeley is the widely distributed leadership. It's not as if we have 2 or 3 or 5 leading figures. We have 30 or 40. 11 times since 1973, one of us has reluctantly been persuaded to do his turn as associate chair. We're not the kind of place where we have people sitting around looking for such opportunities. And 11 times the person has stepped up and dedicated himself for a limited period of time to taking the leadership role as one among equals. Nobody is ever tempted to try to make a career out of it, and it's that sense of egalitarianism which also extends to the junior faculty, who can definitely have a stronger voice as they wish in the affairs of the division. This democratic, widespread leadership approach, I think, is one of our hallmarks and is very valuable. And it's not only the associate chairs who have taken on large responsibilities. People who lead Citrus give freely of their time for the interests of the group, and there are also very time-consuming and critical committee assignments that various of us have taken on and done well. And also, many of us have been involved in setting computing and computer science policy at the national level. So I think this widespread leadership is one of our hallmarks. The discussions on policy among the faculty are always a joy, despite the that wasn't a joke. despite the differences in style, the faculty lunches are always extremely interesting. One can count on Velvel to have something to say which goes completely against the conventional wisdom, but upon further thought seems very sound. Robert Walensky has an incredible ability to listen to a chaotic discussion and then crystallize the main points and make it clear how things ought to turn out. Lotfi Zada often gives us the benefit of his wisdom and vast experience. David Forsyth speaks eloquently as only an Oxford graduate could do. And Alan Smith is always available to tell us that if it ain't broke, we shouldn't fix it. We've been lucky in recruiting and developing our young faculty. It always amazes me. It's if you haven't done it, you don't know how tough it is to be a faculty member in the first years, developing your courses, getting funding, keeping your research going, attracting graduate students. It's an extremely difficult job. I think we do our best to ease the way for our junior faculty. Somehow or other, they all have the maturity to get through this transitional stage from the ease of being a graduate student or a postdoc to suddenly assuming this vast range of responsibilities. And all of our junior faculty have, in the last number of years, have done quite well, and I feel proud of all of them, as well as my more senior colleagues. I think our PhD program is very healthy. The students are selected with great care. There is certainly a rich array of research opportunities. And it's interesting to see how each of the research areas in its own way creates a rich social environment for the students. So I've already described some of the mechanisms that are used in computer architecture and in computer science theory. It's much different. It's much looser and student-initiated, where the students sort of get to know one another, run seminars, write papers together, and do a lot of research that the faculty doesn't necessarily have a hand in. I just wish that in my graduate student days at Harvard, I'd had a situation 1/10 as stimulating as what our students have now. At the undergraduate level, things are good and could be better. Our undergraduates are very capable and hardworking. I think we do a good job of giving them solid and interesting courses. I think we could do better on getting to know them personally, on somehow arranging to have smaller classes and to get them involved in research, or if we can't get more of them involved in research, at least provide for them some kind of capstone experience where they would do a development scale broad project that would prepare them to take responsible roles in industry. And I think that giving them the tools to be innovative is increasingly important because if you're not innovative, then your job is going to be taken away by outsourcing. So we have to give our, and I'm not kidding, and we have to give our students the skills that will make them impervious to that kind of threat. So that's the past and the present. I don't have much to say about the future. I'm confident that we will adapt to whatever trends come along in the field, just as we've done in the past. I know that we're extremely threatened by the budgetary situation in California. After Tuesday, we'll see just how bad the situation is after we see the results of the election. And it's possible that the university will be in for hard times with tuition rising, faculty positions scarcer, but I'm confident that we will carry through, and that if we have one of these shindigs in another 10 years, it'll be just as impressive as this one has been. Yeah, thank you. Oops. Would you like an encore? No, just.